Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He bought 20 copies of the new card Pit of Offerings, which is a grave hate land, so I'm obligated to tell him to leave my perfect zombies alone, please. It's Dana Roach.
That's not a joke. I literally bought 20 copies of Pit of Offerings. That is, we're not making that up here.
No, I know, and I'm not worried at all, I promise.
I did get up early this morning to go Black Friday shopping because I needed a vacuum. It sucks, but what are you going to do?
All right, you know what? Sometimes with the dad jokes, simple is best, and I see that you're really mastering that tactic right now.
Less is more.
I guess so. All right, Dana, it's just the two of us on this week's episode. What is it that we're talking about this week, my guy?
We're going to be talking about weird rules interactions in Commander.
Yeah, strange things that sometimes come up in EDH. We want to talk about those things that might be a little bit unintuitive, just some stuff to help make it easier to play a game of Commander, because it is a complex way to play Magic the Gathering.
Absolutely.
But we got some shout-outs to do before we get to our main topic, so let's go with those.
First, I'd like to thank Chase, also known as Mana Curves, for help editing the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves.
And as Matt loves to say, if you'd like to support the show, you can also find us on the YouTube, like and subscribe on there. You can also subscribe on your podcast app. And of course, you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast if you'd like to support us that way. We love all of your support, no matter in what form it comes in. But if you'd like to get some cool perks like a Patreon shout out or hopping into our Discord and things like that, then you can find us on Patreon as well.
And speaking of Patreon shoutouts, this week we want to shout out Ankur Vazavada for supporting the show. Thank you very much for supporting us. And I think I pronounced your name right. If not, feel free to yell at me.
I think we have to give an encore to Encore for their amazing support of the show.
Right, there we go. Nice. Matt would be proud of that.
And that's just it, right? In Matt's absence, there have to be even more dad jokes, which I'm usually much, much worse at, but I promise I'm learning. Okay. All right, Dana, let's get into our main topic here. We're talking about those weird EDH rules interactions that can sometimes come up in the games that we play. And I'm just going to throw this topic right to you. Where should we start when it comes to strange rules for Commander?
So let's start with a card from a recent set, although I guess when we get a set every 3 weeks, recent is relative.
That's true.
Everybody Lives from the Doctor Who set. It's an instant costing 1 and a white, and it says all creatures gain hexproof and indestructible till the end of turn. Players gain hexproof till the end of turn, and players can't lose life this turn, and players can't lose the game or win the game this turn. That seems pretty straightforward, but it isn't, because Everybody Lives won't stop death to commander damage beyond the current turn. Even though you don't lose life, you are still taking that commander damage, assuming it gets cast, that turn. The same is true of poison. If you get poison counters on you and you're over 10, you won't lose the game that turn. But when it goes to the next turn, you are going to be at 10 poison counters, or you will be possibly at 21 commander damage, at which point you can then lose the game or get killed. So while it does save you for the turn, there are situations where as soon as that effect is gone at the next player's turn, you too can be gone. And that's definitely not something that's apparent on the card. And myself, I wasn't even thinking it in those terms until I saw, I believe it was Charlotte Sable from the CAG made a post on Twitter about it. So that's something very, very easy to miss. And that's going to be relevant at some point in the Commander game, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, commander damage, it's very interesting to think of that. Like, the damage is technically still being dealt there, and that is being tracked even if it didn't actually cause the life loss, because that card isn't saying that the damage is prevented. It's just saying that your life total isn't going to change. And this actually can still come up with cards like Platinum Empyrean, for example, which also says your life total can't change. But technically, I mean, like, you can still have stuff like poison damage hit you, because that's not affecting your life total. It can still be damage technically going on to a player. It's sort of like I think this will probably have come up for folks who play Angel's Grace as well, which is a 1 mana white instant. And specifically on Angel's Grace, it actually kind of calls out this in a way that I think might be a helpful mnemonic for people to remember how these interactions go. Angel's Grace also says this: you can't lose the game this turn, your opponents can't win the game this turn, and until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. Because they didn't want people to get into that accidental, like, yeah, you're at 0, but you can't lose this turn. But then you'll die on the very next turn. That would defeat the, like, what this card is actually trying to do. So Angel's Grace has that little extra rider, and that's a little extra rules thing that can potentially be helpful to keep in mind for the way that Everybody Lives works as well, because this is weirdly complex for some reason.
Right, yes. Yeah, it's like Phyrexian on life, an enchantment where when you're at 0 life, you take damage in the form of poison counters at that point. But that one, just by virtue of the way the card works, it's kind of intuitive. When the Phyrexian on life goes away, well, then you will die from being at 0 life. Yes. It doesn't say anything on the card to remind you, but it's kind of there in a way that's quite apparent. And that's not true with Everybody Lives. Like, unless you really think about it and look at it, it's just not that obvious that could wind up still killing you next turn.
Yeah, definitely a very important thing to keep in mind if you are playing that one. There are some things that everyone won't live the next turn from, so that's important to be aware of, and I think that's kind of cool. I'll move to another tricky rules example one here. And Dana, leave your pit of offerings away from this example.
All right.
Because this example involves the graveyard.
Okay,
is anyone surprised? No one is surprised.
Truce. We're at a truce, pit of offerings truce right now.
All right. Yeah, so a weird rules interaction that I wanted to mention here has to do with a creature that can have negative power in the graveyard, specifically Scourge of the Skyclaves. That is a 2-mana black demon with a big kicker cost. If you cast the spell, if it was kicked, each player loses half their life rounded up. But most importantly for this example here is that Scourge of the Skyclaves' power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. So if no one's lost life yet, this card technically is a -20.
Right.
Which is kind of weird. And for the purposes of it being on the battlefield, that doesn't actually technically really matter. But a thing that it could matter for is the commander Nethroi, Apex of Death. Nethroi has an interesting mutate ability. Whenever this creature mutates, return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Total power 10 or less. And if Scourge of the Skyclaves is in your graveyard, it counts as having -20 power. Which means there's some ridiculous shenanigans that you can do here, where if you are mutating the Nethroi and you've got Scourge as one of the creatures here, it is doing that big reduction thing, so you can get even more on top of that. The -20 counts towards that total power of 10 or less. This is a silly, ridiculous interaction. My brain still can't completely wrap around it, but I mean, it's just a case of a little bit of math, which is probably why it escapes me. But yeah, Nethroi with Scourge of the Skyclaves can do even more busted graveyard stuff, which is ridiculous because Nethroi already does plenty of busted graveyard stuff. And so here's a way that you can add a little bit more spice to it if you want.
Yeah, the ability to kind of have the math that you're doing not count. Like, normally, like, you'd be looking, you're like, okay, this and this and this, and I can use what combination of these 4 creatures. That just like, oh, I'm probably just going to put all of them in play.
Yes.
It just changes entirely what you're going to do and kind of renders the power and toughness, moot in terms of like what you're going to bring in. It's one of those things. Is it worth running in that deck for that possibility? It's such a powerful effect that like maybe that's like definitely something worth considering in that situation. And until it gets pointed out to you, whoever is going to think of that or make that connection.
Yeah, it's absolutely ludicrous. Like when this is such a niche thing to come up in the first place, and also totally being honest, I think that Nethroi is probably already doing so much ridiculous busted stuff by reviving a bunch of 0 and 1 drop creatures that aristocrats your opponents to death anyway. That like you may not even need this, but the fact that it can happen is like whoa.
So we mentioned how Everybody Lives could conceivably be something that like winds up impacting a game at some point. This next one is one that I guarantee I have messed up at some point, and it's the card Gaias Touch. It's an old enchantment from the dark, and it oftentimes gets used as kind of a bargain replacement for exploration or burgeoning or something. It's double green, and it says you may play an additional land during your turn if that land is a basic forest. That's what it says on the card. But there's actually some Oracle text that's worded a little bit differently that says you may put a basic forest card from your hand onto the battlefield. And that's pretty relevant because that means if you're playing like a Crucible of Worlds or something, and you have the ability to play a card from your graveyard, or if you are playing a red-green deck and you're playing a lot of impulse draw kind of stuff, it's you can't then use the Gaia's Touch to play that second land because it has to be from your hand.
Yes.
And as someone who had a landfall deck for a lot of years and was using those effects, the Ramanab Excavator or the Crucible Worlds, to oftentimes play a land, I'm fairly sure I have at some point messed this up, just because the card as written is not necessarily what it does.
Yeah, this one has errata that literally turns that first line of text into an activated ability. Like, it is a pay 0, : you can put the basic forest from your hand onto the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery and only once each turn. And it also has an extra ability of sacrifice to get sacrificed enchantment to get some mana. Like, okay, woohoo. But like, yeah, this is another one of those things where, Dana, you're pulling out cards like Simulacrum and stuff where you're just like, hey, here are some old cards where the wording on this is big different, very, very different. Mm-hmm. And this can matter a whole lot for like not just when you are like where you're able to play those cards, but there also are plenty of cards out there that care specifically about the act of playing a land as opposed to lands entering the battlefield. I think of Horn of Greed as maybe one of the most classic examples. Whenever a player plays a land, then they can draw a card. This would not count for that because this is technically actually an activated ability that is putting a land into play, but not the act of playing a land. And that probably sounds like a whole bunch of nonsense, but that is just like a distinction that really matters in terms of the game effects that you'll glean.
There's multiple weird things about this card that are easy to play incorrectly.
Yeah.
And I still think it is an excellent budget alternative if you're playing a deck that wants to ramp like this and you've got extra lands in hand and you don't want to pay the cost for a exploration or something. I think it's an excellent card. But be aware that there's a couple things on it that aren't very apparent in how it works if you're just like looking at the old version from the dark, which is the only version that exists. It has never had a reprint. So there's some pretty wonky text on there, and just be aware that it's a little bit different in how it plays than how it reads.
Yes, yeah, and those are very, very important to keep note of. One other weird thing that I'll jump to, and it's actually one that I've mentioned on the show before, but I still see it come up in the games that I play. It's a thing that I find is just like, oh, this is worth the whole table noting real quick, is the way that Goad works with Planeswalkers. And this is actually something that I made a whole deck about before I took the deck apart, because it turns out that it was a lot more controlling than I thought it would be. But I once had a Cardor deck, which has basically a type of a Goad ability. But like, if we take a specific look at the wording of Goad, like on the card Disrupt Decorum, for example, Goad all creatures that you don't control, really cool sorcery. And Goad specifically says, until your next turn, those creatures attack each combat, if able, and attack a player other than you, if able. And a way that we sort of mentally shorthand stuff like Goad is like, oh, my creature is forced to attack. And that, I think, kind of mentally we just sort of like glide over, like people are like, oh, I have to attack, and there's a Planeswalker there, so I'll attack the Planeswalker. I'll attack that Planeswalker. But with Goad, no, you can't. With Goad, you cannot attack a Planeswalker. You have to attack a player other than the person who goaded you, if able, which means Planeswalkers are safe, which is what I built that whole card tour deck around. Like, oh, I'll just basically goad my opponent's stuff all the time so that they have to hit players other than me, if able, and they can't attack Planeswalkers, and that feels amazing. It felt amazing for me. Didn't feel amazing for my opponents. Dana, I hope that you're happy that I took that deck apart.
Yeah. Well, this kind of dovetails into another card that functions in a similar way. You know, we see Propaganda or variants on that. See quite a play in Commander.
Sure. Yeah.
And the way Propaganda is worded, creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. Very, very often people think that means I can't attack your side of the board, and that's not true. You can still attack Planeswalkers that person controls with the Propaganda out without having to pay the tax. Mm-hmm. And that's a very easy thing to miss if you're not reading that card carefully. So like, it's very similar to how that Goat interaction works, where kind of the opposite version of that in a lot of ways.
Well, and I've found that I've accidentally protected an opponent's Planeswalker using these types of effects in my Karazakar deck, for instance. Like, I've goaded something, and like Dana, let's say I goaded one of your creatures, and meanwhile Chase has Chandra in some form or another on their board. Mm-hmm. And you, even though I've like forced your creature to attack, right. But like, yeah, you can't attack Chandra, even though it is one of my opponents, and goad usually means hit my opponent's stuff, not me. Mm-hmm. Goad specifically is like, no, it's gotta be a player. So I've accidentally oopsed into protecting a Chandra that I didn't mean to protect in some ways. Yeah. And that is just a very specific interaction worth noting about the way that goad works. It isn't like necessarily too tricksy, but I definitely still see it catch a couple of people up from game to game. And so I wanted to make sure that we pointed it out on this episode, because it is a little bit different than maybe what you first expect when you are like, oh, I've got to attack with all my stuff. There is an extra restriction on that is worth taking note of.
Here's a pretty easy one, but it does get missed quite a bit. And it's the kind of thing that I actually hear judge calls about very frequently at events. Things that care about you gaining life for the turn. There's a lot of different commanders that do that. I have one Tavash Gloom Summoner where you can spend life equal to the amount of life you gained that turn to make a giant demon. But life you gained can just be life totals changing. If there's some effect that lets you say swap a life with somebody, for example, and you have a higher life total, you functionally gained life, even though you haven't done anything that gained you life, quote unquote, in the way that we think about it. And there's a lot of things that do that, and that's not readily apparent under that effect. And I've seen that. That's something that I've actually seen come up multiple times where people are confused and don't realize that actually causes a life gain trigger for various different things that care about that kind of thing.
Yeah, this is actually were I a master of rules to be able to change stuff, I would consider this one something that I would potentially change.
Yeah.
It's unintuitive in both directions is the problem. If you are playing a card like Resolute Archangel, it says when it enters your life total, if your life total is less than your starting life total, it becomes equal to your starting life total. To me, that means that it is just suddenly different in the same way that a creature becoming an O1 or something like that. Well, that's just it's not that it got -3, -2 or whatever. It just became an O1. There wasn't an actual act of transfer or energy shift or whatever like that. And so for me, Resolute Archangel wouldn't necessarily count as life gain. Specifically, the reason that I would want to feel that way is because it is affected by stuff like Alhammaret's Archive.
Right, yeah.
That's the thing that trips me up. If you play a Resolute Archangel, let's say your life total is at 20, and Resolute Archangel wants to reset your life total to 40. Technically, what happens in the rules is that you would gain 20 life in order for your life total to go back to 40, rather than it just becoming, which it's just become. So if you had an Alhammaret's Archive in play, technically what would actually happen is that your life total becomes 60 because you would gain 20 life, and then that would be gain 40 life.
Right.
But then your life total didn't become 40, so to me, I'm just I don't like that. To me, that feels weird. But also, I get why it's totally unintuitive if people see that their life total went from 20 to 40 and they didn't get the trigger off of Archangel of Thune, which would give you pluses if your life total goes up. So it's unintuitive in both ways, which is a big problem there. But yes, becoming a thing is still technically an energy transference, which is a great thing to point out. I love that you brought this one up.
Well, and the inverse of that also works if something causes you to, again, say swap life with an opponent and you're at 20 and they're at 40 and you guys exchange your life totals and you wind up losing your life in that regard. Something like Wound Reflection will make you lose that life again. So it goes both ways. Swapping life totals or something changing your life total in that regard counts as a loss of life as well.
Yeah, that's a really good thing to point out.
And it's one of those things once you know it works that way, it's pretty easy to catch every point then moving forward. But if you aren't aware that's how it works, it's really easy to miss every example of it that comes up in a game. So yeah, and as I said, I've seen a lot of judge calls, or by a lot, I mean it's happened several times, but that specific rules interaction is something that folks miss out on for sure.
Yeah. But you know what we don't want to miss out on? We don't want to miss out on segues into Challenge the Stats, which is the thing that I'm reclaiming.
I knew I waited too long. I was like, I've given him too much rope here and he's going to take it. Yes, you did.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? You can buy so many Pit of Offerings to exile cards from my graveyard, but you can't keep my segues away from me forever, Dana.
Right,
I will eventually get them back. I will eventually. Anyway, yeah, we have a lot of other examples to get to, but there's also a lot of data on EDHREC that we don't always agree with. So we'll be right back to challenge some stats right after this quick break. Give yourself the gift of insane savings this holiday season with Mint Mobile's best wireless deal of the year. Right now, when you switch to Mint Mobile and buy any 3-month plan, you'll get another 3 months for free. That's 6 months of premium wireless service for the price of just 3. Listen, we're Magic players. We love 2-for-1s, but this is a 6 for 3. Mint Mobile lets you order and activate from home while saving tons on phone plans plans, starting at just $15 a month. And I can't think of a better gift than turning an overpriced wireless bill into just $15 a month. Use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan and switch easily and effortlessly with eSIM, or if you need a new device, for a limited time, get 6 months of free service when you buy a select device and plan. For a limited time, buy any 3-month Mint Mobile plan and get 3 more months free by going to mintmobile.com/EDH. That's mintmobile.com/EDH. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/EDH.
Our listener challenge this week is brought to us by Kyle, also known as Moog272. And Kyle wants to challenge the card Body Count in Teysa Orzhov's Scion decks. Body Count, 2 and a black for an instant. Draw a card for each creature that died under your control this turn, and it's a spectacle cost of a single black. So you can cast this spell for a spectacle cost rather than its mana cost if an opponent lost life this turn. Teysa Orzhov's Scion is the original Teysa from way back in Guild Pact. Sacrifice 3 white creatures and remove a target creature from the game. And whenever another black creature you control is put into a graveyard from play, put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying into play. So Teysa decks are oftentimes sacrificing a whole bunch of stuff, making tokens, flopping things in and out of the graveyard, trying to create as much havoc as possible and make a whole ton of tokens. And a lot of times the body count in a single turn is really, really high. Having played a Teysa deck, it's not unusual sometimes to have double digits worth of creatures leave play in a single turn, depending on what you're doing. Currently, right now, body count is in just 9% of Teysa Orzhov's Scion decks, which is about 90 total decks. It's a ridiculous draw spell in the right deck, and this is the right deck for it. Kyle says it's probably the best draw spell in his deck, and I absolutely believe it. It's just a good card in general, and if you are playing a deck that's putting a lot of bodies into the yard in a single turn, you can get a tremendous amount of value from it. So body count, take a look at it in a lot of decks, but Teysa Orzhov's Scion, definitely take a look at it there.
Dana, I like this challenge, but I hate that you said way back in Guild Pact. Are you trying to make me feel old, man? Like,
I mean, that was like 20 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. I started learning back in like Dark. I learned how to play Magic like in Darksteel, and also then in like Ravnica, the original Ravnica set as well. So like a Guild Pact to me was just like ooh, and I'm like, oh, there's no way it can be old. But no, we've gone back to Ravnica so many times. Like yeah, original Ravnica Guild Pact is indeed way back. It counts as way back.
To be precise, it was only 17 years ago, Joey. I checked.
I feel like that makes me feel worse, actually. Anyway,
right, yeah, right.
I'll go to my challenge now. I've been playing a bit with the Doctor Who precons, and I've been enjoying my time with them, but I am definitely noticing that some of them lack some firepower. I've had a lot of success with the villains precon there because it has a unified theme of kill your opponent's stuff and make them lose a whole bunch of life. Like, no matter what era of Doctor Who you're in, all of those things want your opponents to not be there anymore, and they all do a really unified, a cool thematic job of doing that. Some of the other decks I've had a little bit of issue with, like, closing out a game, so I wanted to turn my attention towards the win conditions in one of the decks this week. Specifically, I'm going to look at the 13th Doctor with Yasmin. That is the Teamer deck, Paradox. You want to play a bunch of stuff from anywhere other than your hand. One of those commanders is going to fuel you by giving you stuff that you can play from exile, and another one of them is going to give you +1 counters whenever you cast stuff from anywhere other than your hand, and it untaps your stuff. It's a neat little interaction there, but there aren't a lot of like specifically dedicated win conditions in the deck, and so that is what I wanted to look at here. Because some of the coolest cards that you could use, some of the most popular cards that you could use as a win condition for this style of deck are like Passionate Archaeologist. And like, that's a great card, but it's also hovering around $15 right now. So I wanted to shout out some other budget potential options to help you fill up a board. And I guess this is kind of a twofer challenge. Nasari, Dean of Expression, and the weird Is It enchantment, The Lost and the Damned, are cards that I think are worth looking at if you're sprucing up your 13th Doctor and Yasmin deck. The Lost and the Damned is a simple enchantment that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control from anywhere other than your hand, or you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, you get a 3/3 red spawn creature token. And Nasari, Dean of Expression, is probably really overlooked because it's actually the back half of Uvilda. Who cares about Uvilda? We don't care about Uvilda. The back half here, Nasari, is just actually a very amazing red card because it has the stolen strategy effect, where it lets you steal from the top of your opponent's libraries every upkeep, and whenever you cast a spell from exile, it gets +1 counters on it. A buddy of mine has Nasari as a deck. It goes absolutely haywire how much value that gives you, and Nasari gets real big real fast. And both of these cards are like barely 50 cents, but they're also barely showing up on the 13th Doctor and Yasmin page. Like one of them shows up in maybe a fifth of those decks, and Nasari doesn't show up on her page even at all. So I think that these are worth looking at if you are upgrading one of your Doctor Who precons. These are things to give a consideration to, because when you were playing a bunch of stuff from anywhere other than your hand, these cards go absolutely haywire and can flood the board with stuff that will actually help you close out those games.
Yeah, that's a really good pick. And I also have a feeling we're going to have a lot of these things come up with these Doctor Who cards. The companion and Doctor interactions create so many interesting combinations that there's just bound to be like really cool things that people miss and find out. So I'm looking forward to like the next year of various challenge stats involving doctors and companion interactions.
Yeah, I would have loved to spend a little bit more time on them, but it's been 6 weeks and they're already the 6th oldest set.
Exactly. So. Yeah. It just never ends. Just like our attempts to steal your segue.
Yeah, no, those will end. Those will end. I'm going to need you to stop.
All right.
I'm going to need you to stop. All right. All right, well, Dana, we're going to get back into our main topic here about weird EDH rules interactions, some strange stuff that can sometimes come up during a Commander game that may not seem super intuitive at first. And I'm going to take this next one specifically because it comes up in one of my decks here. So I see it decently often enough, and I have to explain it decently often enough because it is definitely unintuitive. I have a Baracos deck that uses the card Reconnaissance in it. And just like you were pointing out with some cards that lie to you, this is one of those cards. This is one of those cards where it's just like, oh, what it says is actually like sometimes just not true at all. Reconnaissance is a 1-mana white enchantment that says 0 as an activated ability, so 0: remove target attacking creature you control from combat and untap it. And then it has reminder text, which is a lie. The reminder text fully is lying to you. It says, the reminder text is that creature neither deals nor receives combat damage this turn. And that might have been true when they printed this card. It is no longer true because it turns out the way that combat works, there's like a beginning of combat step. There's a declare the attacker step. There's a declare the blocker step. There's a damage step, and then there's an end of combat step. And during the end of combat step, the stuff that was attacking is still considered an attacking creature. So you can use Reconnaissance on your creatures that attacked after they dealt damage and still get the Reconnaissance benefit and untap them. So you can use this before then, and you can use it after to basically give your creature pseudo-vigilance. This card's really, really good. It's also like $10 right now. Probably like when people catch wise to this, it's a very strong interaction to protect your creatures or to give all of your stuff vigilance no matter what. That's really great. But dang, is it complicated? And I wish that they would make a version that doesn't lie to you.
Yeah, and you know, it probably gets used this way less often, but Maze of Ith functionally works the same way as well. You can untap target attacking creature after damage has already been dealt. And these are both like relics of a time when the combat step didn't quite work the way it works today. So they weren't necessarily made incorrectly. It's just the game itself has shaped itself around them in a really curious way.
Well, and anyone who plays a Eureka deck or just a Ninja deck in general is also going to be really familiar with this end of combat step because you can attack someone with something and then have it deal the damage. And then during the end of combat step, it can still be considered an attacking unblocked creature. And so then you can actually ninjutsu stuff after damage is already done. And that's just like, oh my word, whoa. And like this goes even one step further, and I've been totally blown out in some fun ways in this type of thing as well. For instance, when I was at a Command Fest in Portland, there was actually someone who, I attacked opponent A all out and did a whole bunch of damage. And then opponent B, during the end of combat step, my stuff was still considered attacking. They cast a Settle the Wreckage on me. Because they can, because my stuff is still technically considered attacking. So they got the benefit of one of their opponents taking a whole bunch of damage, and also the benefit of, and now your stuff ain't here anymore to bother me after that point. So there are some really cool tricks that you can do here. It's just that it doesn't feel intuitive for you to still be considered an attacking creature after you've already done your damage. But there are a lot of interesting tricks that can happen when you take advantage of that small, weird space and time.
Yeah, I think I've seen it done that way with an Aetherize as well, where you wait till someone gets hit and then do the bounce if they're not swinging at you at least. So yeah, it's one it's one of those things. Once you're aware that it exists, you can start being like, oh, wait a minute, I can maybe apply this to this card and this card, but you have to be aware that it works that way in the first place.
All right, what's next on your list?
The next one here I want to talk about is moving counters, because this is one that's not terribly intuitive either. And so the Ozolith will be the example I will use. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. So you have a creature with, say, 10 counters on it. It leaves the battlefield somehow. Okay, well, you take those counters and put them onto the Ozolith. Similarly, you have all the creatures with modular out there. In the way modular works, when it's put into a graveyard, so it isn't a leave the battlefield trigger, it has to actually die, but you may put its counters onto a target artifact creature. Because because of the way it's worded, it specifically says take those counters and put them on something else. If you have an Ozolith out and, say, a modular creature out, the way the cards are written, it feels like you have to make a choice, since you are taking those counters and putting them on something. But that's not really what that means. Yeah. Putting counters on a thing means copying those counters functionally. So you can do both. If you have a modular creature out and it dies, you can both move the modular counters onto an artifact creature and onto the Ozolith. You are copying them, and both effects can happen simultaneously. You don't have to choose, because you're not literally moving the counters. You are moving what is basically a copy of those counters, and you can do it multiple places.
Yeah, I've had this come up with, I have a +1 counters deck that uses the Ozolith and Resourceful Defense, which is a white enchantment that has a similar-ish type of ability. Mm-hmm. And again, they say those counters. They say move those counters. So you would expect, literally these exact ones, these dice that I am just picking up here. But apparently there are some Scryfall rules interactions that specify a little bit here. The Ozolith's first ability doesn't move counters off the creature that's left the battlefield. Rather, you put the same number of each kind of counter that the creature had onto the Ozolith. And that's basically how this works. You are able to double dip in those ways, which has come in real clutch from my +1 counter decks, not gonna lie.
Yeah, because it's one of those things I have built. I have a Selesnya deck that I remember when I was building it, looking at Resourceful Defense and Ozolith, I'm like, okay, well, it's nice to have backup, but I also don't love the fact that if I have both of them out, I don't want to play them both because it's redundant. Well, it's not redundant. You get to use the effect for both of them. So yeah, again, not all intuitive, but once you know, very, very useful.
I feel like we almost want to change this episode's title to "These cards just lie to you." Like, these cards are liars.
Right, yeah, right. Basically, yes. We could very much do that.
Your life total becomes, no, that's actually, you gain that much for you to be set to that life total. Or you take those counters, no, you have an equivalent number that you're actually placing. And it's just like, that's mm-hmm. These things lie to you. I mean, it's cool. You can get benefit off of them, but like sometimes it does create those moments where you're just like you're telling a whole table of just like, all right, no, I promise this is how it works. Let me find a judge chat, or let me pull up. Here's the exact ruling, because like that can cause a little bit of a pause in a game sometimes where you're like, guys, I promise this works. It's just really complicated and strange to explain. I'm not trying to pull a fast one on you though. I promise. Like, these cards lie to you.
All right, Joey. So do you have another one here where cards lie to us, or is this going to be just a weird interaction?
Okay, actually, yeah, I've got one that is a bit more of like, oh, this is kind of weird. You have to like look at it pretty darn closely to really catch it, but it's also a little bit more niche. But it can come up for certain commanders. It'll be pretty relevant for. It's kind of a non-bow that doesn't really lie to you, but it doesn't work the way that you want it to, and that's the real sad part. Library of Leng is a really interesting 1-mana artifact that says you have no maximum hand size, and if an effect causes you to discard a card, you discard it, but you may put it on top of your library instead of into your graveyard. And so at first, this seems like a really cool way to protect your hand whenever you're doing a whole bunch of stuff that will manipulate the number of cards in your hand. So if you're playing a wheel, for example, some type of windfall or something like that, then yes, you can choose which cards to keep on top of your library, and then you'll draw those, because that is an effect that causes you to discard some cards from your hand. The sad part of this is that every so often, I see that people want to put this into like a Faldorn deck or into an Anya Falconwrath deck. Sorry, not Anya Falconwrath. Miss Angie. That's an old reference by now, but some people still appreciate it.
That's an old school throwback, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, those specifically don't actually work with Library of Leng the way that folks want them to, because they are discarding cards, but not as an effect. They're discarding cards as part of a cost. So Anya Falconwrath, for example, says tap, discard a card, draw a card. So everything before that colon, that's all the cost of the ability. And Faldorn has a similar thing. Pay 1, tap, discard a card, colon, and then you get the impulse draw effect from Faldorn. Those would not work with Library of Leng because that is a cost right there that is causing you to discard a card. That is not an effect that is causing you to discard a card. And that means you're not going to be able to manipulate the placement with Library of Leng the same way that you would with a wheel effect or an opponent's spell causing you to discard stuff like that. So costs and effects, those are important to keep in mind for careful, small, weird, nitpicky rules interactions like this one.
Yeah, in these things, like, some of the cards we've talked about here are more than a few years old in a lot of cases. But all it takes is like one specific deck that really wants that interaction for that card to see all of a sudden a bunch more play, and then these things start popping up. Like Library of Leng at some point is going to get a reprint. It hasn't had it in a whole lot of years, and there'll be some deck that likes the effect, and then you're going to start seeing a whole bunch of these interactions that you maybe just don't see right now because the card doesn't see that much play.
Yeah. Well, and this is also this is probably more of an old school example too, but this is relevant for some cards like Doubling Season, for instance, because Doubling Season also says if an effect would put one or more counters on no permanent you control, it puts twice as many of those counters. Well, so this is cool for Planeswalkers where they enter with double again, that's great. But their loyalty abilities, those are costs because they come that cost is all right before that colon. So this is the cost of it. So technically putting 2 counters onto your thing to activate their +2 ability, that's not an effect putting counters on your thing, so those don't get doubled. That is a cost. So a Doubling Season doesn't actually hit those, compared to certain other cards which actually would say just any number of counters that get put, that you get extra for any reason. So those are, again, some very small words that you got to hone in on sometimes to get the proper amount of value out of some of these cards.
Yeah, it's almost like we're playing a ridiculously complicated game with 27,000 different possible cards doing weird things and interacting with one another in strange ways that no one anticipated when they actually printed those cards.
Oh, that's ludicrous, Dana. That can't possibly be the case. What are you talking about?
So the last one I have here, Joey, is one that actually came up on our stream fairly recently. Cards that say choose any number of things versus targeting a thing. Now, this is relevant for a couple of reasons. Number one, choosing a thing gets around hexproof and or shroud, which is pretty relevant in a lot of situations. And that's, I think, at least myself, what I always think of when I say choose. I'm like, oh, I get to not have to care about Lightning Greaves. But the other thing that matters when something says choose is the timing changes. Then you don't get to respond. If something targets something, then you can choose to respond by sacrificing it or giving it hexproof or whatever you want to do. Once you get to the point where something is chosen, then the spell starts to resolve and you can't actually do anything until it has actually resolved. You don't get to say, oh, you've chosen my thing, well, I am going to bounce it or I am going to protect it. It's already been chosen. We're past that point. And that's very much not intuitive at all with the cards that are worded that way.
Right. And we got to be very careful with our wording here, just like the cards got to be careful with their wording, apparently. Specifically one that came up on our stream that was similar to this was the card Boom Pile, and that's the one that got you pretty bad.
Yeah.
Boom Pile is a 4-mana artifact, tap, colon. That's the important part, tap, colon. And then the effect is flip a coin if you win the flip, destroy all non-land permanents. And so this is another instance of once the coin flip begins, there's no responding.
Yep.
Once you've gotten to the point of the choosing of the stuff, that is part of the resolution of the ability. So you can respond to the casting of the spell. You can respond to the activation of the ability. But in this case, Boom Pile's activation is there hasn't been a coin flipped yet. Mm-hmm. Or in the case of a card's being chosen or whatever, once you're in the part of oh no, I am choosing things, that means it's all part of the actual abilities being resolved. You could have responded before then, but not before you knew what I was choosing. And that is an important distinction to make, as opposed to stuff that, targets before we even know whether it's going to resolve. And yeah, that's tricky as heck.
Yeah, I think the place where this probably pops up most often is on the card council's judgment. Each player votes for a non-land permanent you don't control, and then you exile each permanent with the most votes or tied for the most votes. Once you've gotten to the point where things are being chosen to vote on there, you've lost the ability to interact and respond to that spell. It's already been cast. It's going to then go to the resolution. So that's also an easy one to miss, because I've definitely seen people get to that point where they're like, oh, okay, people choose like, okay, I'm going to counterspell that because you're hitting two of my things. Like, well, we're past that point.
Right. Yeah. This is definitely very tricky. And I do I kind of actually would almost relate it to like tapping a creature before combat. Like that is a preemptive thing that you have to do. You don't know who that creature is going to hit, but if you can tap someone's creatures before they get to the declare attacker step, then you know that you're safe. But like there is kind of a daring thing that happens there. And I actually really like that element of gameplay of just like, here's the moment to respond. And it's probably incumbent upon us as players to be like, all right, y'all, this is the moment for this to, if anything's going to happen, this would be the place to do it, as opposed to people getting accidentally got or something like that when they find out how it works. Like it can be just good sportsmanship, I think, to like be very, very upfront about how those interactions work.
Absolutely.
But yeah, like you can't tap down a creature after it's already attacking you. Like that, it don't work that way. That's not how that would not prevent it from being able to attack you. Like you've got new information now. We're past the point where that information would have been like the relevant thing. And I do appreciate the cards that kind of like test your opponents a little bit, that sort of dare them. It's just like, all right, here's your moment. Do you think you know what I'm about to do with it, or do you not? And so I'm going to put you in the hot seat now. And those are some fun things to play around with in a game as social as this one.
Absolutely.
But they also can be very complicated, and because they are indeed very different from some of the other stuff. You know, a Rex Sage comes down and it's just like, all right, I target that. All right, cool, I can give it hexproof. But that's not necessarily going to be the case for things like a Druid of Purification, for instance. Because that one, Druid of Purification, has that choose stuff that you were mentioning. When it enters the battlefield, starting with you, each player may choose an artifact or enchantment you don't control, destroy each permanent chosen this way. That's a really cool card. I heckin' love that card. But like, you can respond to the trigger, but you don't know what's been chosen before that point. And so like, once people have chosen stuff, just like the Council's Judgment, too late. And so that's really important for you to keep in mind, depending on how it is that you will respond to those types of spells.
So that's the last weird one I have, Joey. Do you have one final one here to take us on out?
Yeah, I'll go with one that still boggles my mind. And in fact, we actually got to see it completely boggle the mind of Rachel Weeks on a recent Command Zone episode. But we'll reiterate it here. And I think there's a way that we can explain it that might help folks figure out why this rules situation is the way that it is. But if you've got, for example, a Torbrand, which says if your sources would deal damage, they do +2 damage, and you have like a Furnace of Wrath or a Fiery Emancipation that is going to either double or triple the stuff. Here's a weird, stupid thing. And it is stupid, but it isn't stupid, and we'll get to that in a moment. But like, you would expect that, like, let's say I'm going to ping something for 1 damage. You'd expect that you'd be able to have Torbrand add the 2, and then Fiery Emancipation would triple that from there. So you'd go from 1 to 3, and then from 3 to 9. Unfortunately, you're not the one who gets to make that call. The person who's affected by the spell, they are the one who gets to make the call about stuff that is going to, like, when those layers or things that are modifying the damage. The person who's being hit by it, or the person who controls the thing that is about to be hit by it, they make the call. So they can have the Fire Emancipation happen first, and then have Torbrand's +2 go on top of it after. And at first that seems so annoying, right? Like when I first found that out, I was fully in the Rachel Weeks camp of, why is it like this? And like, Dana, I'm sure that you've been got by this kind of thing as well in your own Commander Pass too, right? Like,
yeah, this is kind of thing that like, nothing in the game at all would make me assume it works that way.
Yeah. There is a good reason why it works that way, and this is the only thing that made my mind at all ever calm down about it, so I hope that this can help out some folks out there too. It's a little bit like when you're putting counters onto something. Like whoever controls the thing that's getting counters put onto it, they get to choose how those things stack because it's their deal. The reason for it particularly is because we're in a multiplayer game, which means everyone could have some damage modifying stuff. So like, I could have a Gisela that is having damage to me, but then you have a Fire Emancipation, but then someone else has a Gisela, and then there's another person with a Torbrand. So like, all of those things are going at the same time. And rather than it going into like according to who's the active player and who's not the active player, it'll stack this way. Rather than doing that, the rules just streamline it to, listen, I'm the bone being affected by it. I'll choose how these layers are going to affect things because it's my stuff that's being affected. And it is actually a way of simplifying when multiple people at the table have that type of modification stuff. At long last, when I finally understood, it's because of the fact that there could be so many of these things going on, that at last made me feel like, okay, I have some peace about this. But man, I do not have peace when I have a Torbrand in play and a Fire Emancipation, and I want it to deal 9 damage instead of the 5 or 6 damage or whatever, but they get to choose, not me. So it feels weird and annoying as crap at first, but there is a reason behind it, even if it kind of sucks to find out that way.
Yeah, once you get the explanation and you're like, okay, I see why that is that happens the way it looks like it happens. But until you get it, it's absolutely strange and frustrating.
Yes. And if you want to see someone live through that strange and frustrating, genuinely go watch Rachel Weeks find out how this rules interaction works, because her reaction is priceless. Whew. Okay, Dana, that was a lot of complex stuff. I love playing Commander, I really do, but sometimes these rules are smarter than me, and it's just I just want this game to be straightforward sometimes, and it isn't, and it's just like, dang. But you know what is straightforward? And this is a very ham-fisted joke, but I'm telling it anyway. It is straightforward for you to not use any of the 20 pit of offerings that you just bought to exile any of the things in my graveyard. That would be really, really simple for everyone involved, man.
I will see what I can do. No promises that the pit is demanding offerings, and that's your graveyard.
Oh, man. All right. I'm genuinely having one of those teehee, I'm in danger kind of moments. You were so excited to tell us, so yeah, I just bought all of these. And the only reason that I didn't buy more is because they were out of stock after I got 20.
Yes, I still need to get 4 more.
Yeah. Oh, no, you don't. You don't even have that many decks, man. Like, come on. All right. Listeners, we would love to hear from you about what strange, weird card and rules interactions have come up in your games. Definitely leave them in the comments below. Let your fellow players know about those weirdnesses that can come up in games to make sure that everyone is able to have a simpler and easy time playing the game. And with that, we'll call this episode to a close. So, Dana, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find you on the onlines?
You can find me on the interwebs at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz on the onlines, most likely being a fool on Instagram or something like that. And you can find the cast at EDHRECast online. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for their fantastic work in the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.